Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Down to Business. Today I've got Simon Rutherford joining me from PKF. Simon's been at the firm in many iterations for quite a long time, growing from your standard accountant to these days a much sought after, probably not only business advisor but board member and more in that corporate world. So I've asked Simon to come along today and talk about incentives and how business owners can really use them with their employees to get a much better result, both for their team, but more importantly for them and their business as well. So welcome, Simon.
Thanks, Andrew.
So you've had, as I said, give you a wrap. You had a bit of a history. Tell me about the journey and how you've ended up to be known for this topic we're talking about today.
Well, the journey started in 1984 as a trainee accountant. Over the years, I've worked with many businesses from inception until when they've been able to sell and move into retirement, and I find that very rewarding. And obviously, in any part of that journey, you've got a number of employees and other key people that have roles that they play, and you need to recognise that. And I'm a great believer in make sure you leave something on the table for those that have helped. And incentives, particularly when you do sell your business, allowing them to share, not only does it allow you to attract people, but really reward them for the work that they put in over time. And I think that's great for all parties.
And I imagine, even today, with some of the people you get involved with, incentives still aren't as mainstream as some other topics. Hence why I guess we're talking about it. But over time, I imagine, sort of had to come up with something and fell into it, and at the time probably thought, make mistakes. But realistically, I'd imagine there's no right or wrong necessarily here. It's trying to find what's the most appropriate for a business owner to apply.
I think that's spot on. I mean, if you think about reward, traditionally, it's a bonus. And the bonus might be a discretionary bonus that the boss might pay at the end of the year, or it might be a bonus pool that's shared amongst a bunch of people in the organisation. I think what we're seeing a lot more of now, particularly with technology businesses, and let's face it, there's a raft of them now that can turn from having zero value to quite substantial value on the stock exchange within a relatively short period of time. They're not cash rich. So the best way to reward and attract talent is to be able to give them a share of the pie at the IPO or trade sale or whatever the case may be. So it's a good way to do it. And particularly those employees don't have the cash to invest in the business. Similarly, I think a lot of employers don't necessarily want to offer equity in the business so that they've got to deal with a myriad of issues that exist, with someone else as a shareholder. And there's a whole other range of ways to do that benefits both parties.
Yeah, sure. And even some of the things you just referred to then, probably the big end of town, and that's traditionally where I guess a lot of this logic has been applied. What we want to make sure is that SME business owners, small businesses, etc., understand this can still apply to them as well. It's probably just the scale that changes, because it can be a real effective methodology to get, as I said, extract value and real fulfillment in a business.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, think about the labour market that we find ourselves in now. It's incredibly difficult, probably the most difficult market we've been in for some time. The ability to attract talent and offer them something that the next business can't can often be around the bonus. And I think most people would have the view, if we can grow the pie or we perform better, I'm happy to share that. So then structuring that around performance hurdles and deliverables is a good way to do it.
Yeah, very good. I'd agree. The labour market at the moment, COVID's getting a lot of the blame for it, but I think it's a modern world we're living in, and we have to be realising that we've got transients in our employment base. So, for me, this is something that people can't ignore and go, well, how can I have a win-win without taking all the risk from a business owner's point of view, or the employee takes all the risk?
Yeah, absolutely.
So with that in mind, let's talk more specifically about the incentives themselves and how they're applied. We've spoken a bit about the labour market and what it can do, but I'll spin it another way. Why would it be silly for business owners not to consider this?
Good question. Well, look, silly to not consider it is if you don't get the talent that you need to be able to grow and develop your business, you don't win. Equally, if you want to have a succession plan to be able to sell your business or what have you, again, you don't win. If it's all relying on you, and it can be a very lonely place in business and at the top of business, so I reckon that's a pretty good incentive, right, to offer these things to employees.
Yeah, and I think we've spoken about in previous episodes around the level of business transition and wealth transition that's currently happening off the back of the baby boomers and succession, or lack of succession planning, I guess. So this seems like a real rock in the planning aspect of that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a great market as well. I mean, whilst it's a difficult labour market, with interest rates where they are, there's a lot of capital looking for a home. So it's a good opportunity for baby boomers. But any buyer wants to know that there's sustainability and longevity of the business beyond the owner. So what a great way to do that. And sometimes you might have to offer an incentive for those employees to stay on in the new ownership, right, to try and help underpin the value and embed that value in the new business.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So when we talk incentives and we go, okay, it's just a bonus, or I'm being a bit flippant, but that sort of aspect. I mean, a business owner could just go and apply themselves, and they probably think it's fairly easy. You've got a lot of experience in this space, so why don't you explain to the viewers the role someone like you plays and how you help get a better outcome?
I think that the important thing right from the outset, and the question that I ask the business owner, is what are you trying to get out of it, and then what's in it for the employee, and to really think that through. And often it's not thought through, and I don't try to design any plan. And there's probably 10 or 20 different ingredients that we can use that go into a plan, but I don't try to do any of that until I properly understand. Are the dogs going to like it, right? It's like we've got the dog food, they don't like it, well, I'm not going to sell it, right? So we need to make sure that the employee sees a real benefit and it's tangible, right? And have I got to provide any capital? If I haven't got the capital, it's going to hurt me tax-wise. So you need to deal with all of those types of impediments and make sure that they'll buy into it. And then the employer getting comfortable that, okay, I'm going to dilute my interest, right? I might own 100% when this is finished. I might own 95 or 90, but that's okay because I've got a bigger pie. So I think there's that, and also certainty. I think the biggest risk I see with any of these things is the employees don't believe the message, right? And they're worried about the goalpost being moved. That's the biggest sin you can commit in these situations. So helping with clarity, making sure the plan is designed with clarity, communicated with clarity, and then monitor it along the way, because it can be a real driver when people can say, hey, I'm halfway along the journey, okay, I'll work harder in that, and also keep people focused in the right areas, right, rather than, I work hard at the end of the year, I might get a discretionary bonus, but was I working on the right things?
And I imagine an element that I didn't hear mentioned, but I imagine is right through these designs and negotiations, etc., is emotion.
Oh, absolutely.
And being independent, you can have a handle on that.
We take all of that out. So, and then facilitating the whole process, often with the employees, or we get invited into those sessions to actually communicate it in a very neutral way, right? So it cuts through that and does make it easier for the business owner.
Yeah, sure. So just to reiterate, I mean, before we go into some of a bit more detail, we said a tough labour market. It's obviously something that can really help get someone to join the team or retain, even for that matter. We also said about succession planning, and I think in that aspect it's good to understand what type of business you are. So if you're a heavy services business with not a lot of contracts, etc., you want to retain your people because they're realistically probably your only exit, versus if you're a trade sale with an earn-out, then you want to make sure people are incentivised to grow your total value. So there are a myriad of different reasons why an incentive scheme or incentive program can be effective for your business. And as Simon's alluded to, it's understanding what you're trying to get out of it and then designing it appropriately.
Yeah. I mean, look, tax and the aspects of tax are something that often comes later in the piece, but there's a global battle for talent. Mm-hmm. Everybody wants the best innovators, right, and scientists and researchers in their country, in their team. And our government has introduced early stage businesses that make it really attractive for those employees if they become shareholders or notional shareholders when the business is sold or they extract value at some other liquidity point, that they share materially in the outcome.
Absolutely. So, we've said that these might sound, when you first roll it off the tongue, it sounds quite easy to put in place, but we know they're not. What are some of the keys to a successful outcome in implementing one of these schemes or programs, as opposed to some that you haven't seen go, quite so well?
I think what I said before about certainty and making sure that the people that are in this scheme truly understand it and how they can influence it. And if they do A, how does that manifest itself in B for them as a reward? I think when these things aren't understood, right, that's when it gets particularly difficult. And we need to make it really simple. I mean, it needs to be aligned with the strategy of the business, the goals of the business and the owner, and if you like, the KPIs or the hurdles that are created are really clear, and how that the employee would implement it.
And I imagine, like many of the topics we've discussed in this forum, time and time for planning rather than trying to knee-jerk, implement something like this?
Most of these schemes, it can take up to 6 months, certainly 3 to 6 months to implement from the first time that we sit down and talk through, okay, what are you trying to achieve? How does that align with the business strategy and business goals? We then might do a sort of a quasi-term sheet that we then socialise with the employees to make sure, right, yep, it makes sense, they understand it, and we might use a bit of an example. If you do X, it might mean that you can have this amount of reward in dollar terms, because that's what they relate to.
Yep.
And I mean, obviously incentives can be both short-term and long-term. The term short-term incentive STI gets used a lot, long-term incentive LTI. Short-term incentive is usually 12 months, so it's more akin to a traditional bonus, and it's usually paid in that term. In that way, sometimes it gets paid as shares, but normally in a public company domain. The beauty of that is if you pay in shares, sometimes you can defer the effective taxing point, and also it gives them, it aligns them to the business longer term rather than just paying a physical cash outcome. But I think the important thing with a short-term incentive is getting the mix between financial and non-financial KPIs. It's not all finance.
The KPIs being key performance indicators, yeah?
Yeah, because look, if everything is short-term and focused on short-term profit, that does not always benefit the business in the long run. So often you'll see a mix of maybe 60% financial outcomes and 40% might be other outcomes. It might be a human outcome. It might be a marketing outcome. It might be an acquisition. It might be implementing a new system.
Yeah, it's the stuff laying the foundation for the future.
Absolutely. So I think if you focus people on the wrong things, you get what you...
Yeah, I've seen it quite effective before as well, where you have the concept of gate openers, and obviously being behavioural traits that have to be achieved, or as you said, foundational traits that have to be achieved before you even worry about the amount of the bonus.
Yeah. Not least of which is culture. If you might have your best person in the organisation of generating sales, but if they do that in a way that's not aligned with the culture of the organisation, that could destroy value in the long term.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I've seen it played out. I guess one of the other things that comes to mind, and speaking from experience, that incentive has to actually incentivise. I know it sounds a bit funny, but you could put up cash, which I think a lot of people would be aligned to that, but not everyone, and it might incentivise people. I think one example to share I've seen before is where at the end of the day it can be calculated straight back to cash, but I've seen someone say, no, I don't want that bonus, until we offered a holiday, and they were quite incentivised, even though the holiday actually was cheaper than the cash amount we were putting up there. So it's funny how the mind works with some people and what they actually are motivated by. Yeah,
exactly. And the other element of that is tax. If it's cash invariably it's just taxed as normal income that sits on top of your normal pay. Now, if you're at top marginal rate, 47% hurts a lot, right? So in terms of, you might have a bonus that says, oh, I'm going to get 100,000, but all of a sudden it turns into 50,000 for your work. That changes things quite a bit, particularly in the long term. Long-term incentives typically are 3 to 4 years plus, right? Not much more than 5, because going beyond a 5-year horizon is problematic. But if it's taxed as a capital gain, generally that means that the person will pay half the tax that they would otherwise pay. And if it's structured effectively within the ATO rules, it can be on capital account. So again, if someone gets a bonus of $1 million and you're comparing, do I pay 250 tax or do I pay 500 tax? It's a pretty meaningful difference at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely.
So important to structure it in the right way.
And that structuring starts from the get-go.
It does.
Yeah. And the other thing I'll just pick up, and you said it before, very important for a success, I imagine, that both parties understand, very clearly what the hurdles are, how it gets paid, all the details, so we don't have a disgruntled party on either side, at the end.
Yeah, I totally agree. Typically, we would do, once we've socialised it, we'd do a term sheet that says, look, this is all the key elements to make sure they're okay. Then we engage with lawyers to properly document the plan and the plan rules. And what you see often accompany the plan rules is a Q&A and a frequently asked questions. And I think you've got to get down to that level, because if you're thinking it, they're obviously thinking it as well. So I think it's really important to think about that. And you do get into situations where you can you need to protect the business as well. If somebody does the wrong thing, right, the concept of a good leaver and a bad leaver under these circumstances, like if someone gets sick, it's not, right? They haven't created it, so a good leaver. But if they leave and go to a competitor, it's a very, very different outcome. And you obviously don't want to be paying the bonus in those circumstances. So we need to make sure we get all the financial elements and them understanding, if I do A, I then get B, but also some of the legality around how are they protected, but how is the employer protected?
No, absolutely. And I want to just pick up on, you mentioned STI and LTI, okay? And I will say, and again from prior chats and experience, that there's no right or wrong, and you can design these things nearly anyway. Provide you've got to comply with the regulators, etc. But there's so many elements, and people might have heard employee share schemes or vendor finance arrangements or bonuses, etc., etc. We're going to focus a bit more on STIs and LTIs. What are some of the elements that, if you haven't covered already, around an STI that are important for a business owner to maybe note or just keep in mind?
I think probably the first one with an STI is generally employees going to look at their package as a whole. So it might be their base plus benefits plus the bonus. Typically, most STIs are a percentage of the employment package. And it tends to range, right? Sometimes the CEO could be up to 50%, but for the rest of the executive, it could be sort of 30 to 40%, which is a meaningful number of their annual remuneration that they could earn in the STI. The STI could be paid at the end of the year, or I've seen various companies pay it out progressively, so it can be used as a retention tool as well as reward. So,
which I'll pick up on that one, because I know that like you could start a very, very good 6 months for the start of a financial year, pay your bonuses out, and then fall off a cliff for the last 6 months. And when you look at the total, you've overpaid. How do you handle that?
Well, I guess two aspects. Rather than breaking the year into quarters or half years, making sure it's a full year and it is a full year performance. But I guess you could have the same issue. It's a full year. We get to September when, after the end of the financial year, we're paying bonus. I've seen some organisations pay a third at completion, and then maybe a third a year on, or a third thereafter. And generally, the requirement is that there's not a material reduction in the business, but also that the person's still in the chair doing their job, hence the retention element.
But I imagine as long as there's transparency, again, that understanding's there, and people can see that, in the spirit of it, both parties can't go backwards, that's easy enough to negotiate.
Yeah, and it works well. Yeah, I mean, generally STIs are paid in cash, but you could have some paid in shares. And if the business goes north, then those shares that are held back for 12 months, 2 years, 3 years, there might be a bit of a kick in the reward.
Okay. And the other one you mentioned was around long-term incentives, LTIs. I guess a lot more complexity because you're dealing with a longer-term play, and you are probably dealing more with that ownership element and that sort of thing as well. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, LTIs are a lot more involved. Generally with an LTI, you're thinking about a concept of dilution, and there's a range of metrics that are market-determined metrics. But generally, it's passing the smell test with the shareholders, because most of these LTI schemes don't just get approved by the board, right? They need to be approved by the shareholders, because ultimately you're going to dilute value for the shareholders. Typically, you'll see maybe up to 5% dilution, sometimes a bit higher in early stage companies. So you need to think about that firstly. The second thing is you don't want to dilute your shareholders' interests if the pie doesn't grow. So what I mean by that, if the pie doubles and you're giving up 10%, everybody's happy. So what we often see in designing an LTI is we have hurdles, and the hurdle might be, it's often expressed in a couple of different ways. Earnings per share, that's probably more a corporate an ASX type measure, or total shareholder return, and probably one that's more understood. And the sort of return a shareholder would get would be a combination of dividends and capital growth. And often I see the hurdle might be set at 10%. So as long as the company's growing by the total shareholder return is more than 10%, then the LTI is in play, and the shareholders are saying, well, I've earned 10% minimum on my money in terms of the growth and the dividend. I'm happy to give up 5% of the company if that can be achieved. The other thing we often see is it's done on a ratchet basis. So at 10%, it might only be they might get 20% of the reward. But if they can get total shareholder return to 15 or 20 or 25%, I think 25% for a lot of shareholders, they'd be pretty happy, then that might be where you see the full incentive paid. And it's done on a compound basis over the term, because you can obviously have good years and bad years, right? So it needs to be considered over the life of the plan.
Okay. And I mean, LTIs, I'd imagine, would be a lot more common where you're after that business growth or setting up for a sale.
A liquidity event's pretty much paramount in any of these, because if there's no cash, right, if you haven't got the cash to pay the employee, right, because then it's in the form of a bonus, well, that's not particularly pretty tax-wise, you do need some end event. Right? So whether it be an IPO or a trade sale where there is cash that you can give them for their shares, you definitely need those elements to make it really effective.
Yeah. No, that's good. I think, just by the brief conversation we've had, you can see, the various elements that could go a bit skewed if you don't get this right. So just, for me, what I took out of that, and for a business owner, is really that these should be looked at regardless of what your size your position is. If you're trying to attract talent, retain talent, if you're trying to set up for a sale, if you're trying to get business growth, if you're trying to incentivize people generally so you don't have just to take all the risk with base wages, you need to look at an incentive structure or program or whatever that may be. Make sure that you're using someone that understands it and has experience, because if they don't, well, generally you're not going to, nor will your employees, and that's just, I think, a combination that will lead to disaster. Or won't get the outcome you're after. By using an advisor who knows their stuff or takes the emotion out of it, they can, as you said, position things from a neutral stance, which I think was really good for people to take into account. Make sure the incentive actually incentivizes, it motivates, what you're providing. Make sure that you consider both financial and non-financial traits. I think that was a good one. And really, are you looking at STI, which is probably more short-term, bonuses, etc., versus LTI, the longer term, where you're getting people in for that, real liquidity event or as I said, a succession or something like that. So I've probably missed stuff there, mate, but I think,
I think you summed it up pretty well. I think the one thing I thought of as you were talking through that is making sure that, particularly with an LTI, 3 to 5 years can be a long time, making sure we're measuring it along the way, what's working, what's not working. And ultimately, all of this must be aligned to your strategy, right? If we want to make sure that we're incentivising them to do the things, right, that will achieve the strategic goals of the business and the owners.
No, that's great. And I think, as we said, in the labour market we're in, this can't be neglected. And using people like yourself at PKF, can't go wrong. So thank you, Simon.
Thanks, Andrew. Enjoyed it.
Thanks for watching another episode of Down to Business. Until next time. Cheers.